I cover all three of the groups: veteran, disabled veteran, and person with a disability. I experienced life prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which really transformed life for people with disabilities, not in the United States but around the world. People ask me what was the biggest change in my life after the Americans with Disabilities Act, and really, quite frankly, the biggest change was that the United States government recognized, and I think eventually the U.S. citizens started to recognize that people with disabilities are citizens and they have value in society. I think the challenge that you basically alluding to is that it's not so much that we need to do more for our veterans or our veterans with disabilities or people with disabilities, is we need to work more to integrate them into society and to include them in opportunities, because it's really good for all of us. There's tremendous talent in our veterans population and in our population of people with disabilities that the U.S. and the world could benefit from if only we provide the opportunities and the resources for people to contribute, and also the recognition that they have value and they can add value to our communities.
Welcome to On Board with Transparent Leadership, an Easterseals podcast. I'm Kendra Davenport, President and CEO of Easterseals, and I am joined today by Dr. Rory Cooper, who is a board member at Easterseals. Rory has a really amazing background, and I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you all just how amazing he is and read through his whole bio. I typically don't do that, but this is so impressive, and what we're going to cover today, I think, will really benefit from you knowing all that Rory has achieved in his life. Dr. Rory Cooper is the founding director and Virginia Senior Research Career Scientist of the Human Engineer Researching Laboratories at the University of Pittsburgh, where he also serves as the FISA and Paralyzed Veterans of America Professor and Distinguished Professor of the Department of Rehabilitation, Science and Technology. He's also professor of bioengineering, physical med and rehab, and orthopedic surgery. He's an adjunct professor at the Robotics Institute of Carnegie Mellon University, as well as in physical medicine and rehab at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences, named an honorary professor at Hong Kong Polytechnic University and Xianjiang, I hope I'm getting that correct, University, where he was awarded an honorary doctorate. Dr. Cooper has authored more than 350 peer-reviewed journal publications and has more than 20 patents awarded or pending. The author of 2 books, his work has been covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, CNN, Forbes, NBC, ESPN, NPR, and other national and international media outlets. Dr. Cooper earned his BS and Master Engineering degrees in Electrical Engineering from Cal Poly, and earned a PhD in electrical engineering and computer engineering with a concentration in bioengineering from the University of California at Santa Barbara. In 1988, he was a bronze medalist at the Paralympic Games in Seoul, Republic of Korea, and was awarded the International Paralympic Scientific Achievement Award in 2013. An elected fellow of the National Academy of Inventors, Dr. Cooper is a recipient of numerous awards, including the Samuel E. Heyman Service to America Medal and the Secretary of Defense Meritorious Civilian Service Medal and the National Guard Bureau Minuteman Award. Wow. I mean, I got to come up for air, Rory. That's an awful lot. And as I was saying to Rory, who my husband had the pleasure of meeting a couple years ago, he's jealous of this conversation today because Rory is a very impressive human being. And most of the people we interview, I have the pleasure of interviewing on this podcast, are very impressive. But Rory kind of takes the cake. And I really want to thank you before we even get into this, Rory, for making time for this, because I understand you have another pretty significant event you're going to dash to as soon as we finish this conversation. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Sure. The Heinz History Center, which actually is an affiliate of the Smithsonian here in Pittsburgh, named after our former senators, John Heinz, as well as the Heinz family, which many of you know from their condiments, is opening an exhibit on me at in their museum today in Pittsburgh. So we have to run down there for a press conference and sort of a yeah, kind of a reveal ceremony.
Well, we won't keep you long, but while I have you, I want to talk a little bit about leadership. Um, I think you're an innate leader, and I think you're very driven. Can you talk about some of the things that motivate you to do all you've done? I mean, even just your degrees, Rory. You're a lifelong student, so that takes drive. It also takes a lot of the qualities that we find in people who are innate leaders.
It's hard to say. I mean, I was an Eagle Scout, and I learned a lot from scouting and from our World War II veterans and Vietnam veterans that were the leadership in our scout troop. And my time in the Army, I like to share people when I went to the non-commissioned officers basic course. They taught you really. I took home really sort of two important lessons, and one of them is the concept of selfless service and doing something for something greater than yourself. And the other one is if you sort of take care of your people, they'll take care of you. And and then I think after my accident and winding up with a spinal cord injury and using a wheelchair and having to sort of redefine my life, I think it didn't take me very long to discover that the needs of people with disabilities and how we were represented in society and what our capabilities were, or what our opportunities were, and I think that drove me to. And I've been very fortunate to have really great mentors. When my uh, not only scout leadership, but a friend of mine from when I was a kid, Gary English, we were in our Eagle Scouts together, and then great coaches in the high school at the Army. My Army coach, Joe Young, and I are still friends and communicate with each other. My first company commander in the Army is a leader in the AMVETS, and we're also still in contact with each other, which is amazing because it's been a few years since I served in the Army. But and my undergraduate advisor when I was a student, Saul Goldberg, who's also my master's advisor, was a wonderful mentor, and I probably got into this field professionally because of my graduate PhD advisor, Steve Horvath, has since passed away. But Steve, one day we're spending some time talking in my office, and he sort of said, you should really make rehabilitation engineering and technology and create opportunities for people with disabilities to your career. I don't can't I can't think of anybody that would be better at it, and so I think that's also helpful too because
Mm-hmm.
you need people that you can emulate, that you can learn from, and and that sort of can give you feedback along the way, and so that's been very beneficial for me, and I helped develop me, I think, as a leader. And then I'm very fortunate because first I work with a great team that's highly motivated, highly talented, and really has their heart in the right place, and then to work with and serve with other people with disabilities who are really trying to make a difference in the world is makes it very makes it easy as well.
You mentioned you were an Eagle Scout, and I think that really takes us back to your adolescence, your early adolescence, and your commitment to service sort of permeates. Doesn't sort of it permeates your entire career, and even now, I think the things that you focus on, and as you said, really devoting your life to rehabilitation post accident and all of your degrees that evolve and revolve around that. Is that something that your parents instilled in you, the commitment to service, or is it something that evolved? And I ask that because I'm from a military family. I'm married to military, and I think in my life it is a theme that has been very, very prevalent, and I think it was derived in large part from military service that my father committed to, and my husband. How about you?
So my father served in the army, and several of my great uncles and my uncles, and so certainly, that was something I thought of. I think and then like I said, the scout leaders and coaches were great mentors for me as well. So, I think so. From an early age, you see that community of military and veterans and people in their community giving back. I grew up in a small town in San Luis Obispo, California. It's a bit larger now, but it was quite a bit smaller when I was growing up. Um, well, actually, first 10 years of my life, we grew up in East LA and Riverside, but in San Luis Obispo, it was a very small community, um, and you could, I was as a as a young person, I was influenced a lot by what the what Rotary would do and what the Lions Club would do and the Elks Club and the different scouting events. And I think it just sort of instills how it's important to be part of your community and part to give back. And so that, yeah, I think that started early on. Of course, when I was real little, we saw soldiers and others and what they would do, and so um, I think so. And then when I did my own time in the military, I had the great fortune to just be with amazing soldiers and units and leaders, and I think that sort of solidified those early roots and led me to a lifelong path, essentially.
You talked about many of the people who have been mentors to you, and I'm a firm believer that mentors influence you throughout your life. Sometimes when you're not even aware that they're mentoring you, just leading by example and becoming people that you look up to, that you want to, as you said, emulate. Um, when you think about mentorship, what are some of the qualities you think mentors, and I'm sure you mentor people, Rory, just because of your nature. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you try to instill or impart as a mentor and what some of your most memorable, you mentioned them by name, at least three mentors instilled in you. What were those qualities that they brought to the relationship that helped you?
I mean, I think the two things, really is time is the most valuable thing we have, and being willing to give time and to sort of listen and to guide. And then I think the other one is genuinely caring, taking a genuine interest in another person or in other people and in their success. And I think that was really important for me. Uh, you know, but I was injured in 1980. For those people that don't know, that's prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and even prior to implementation of Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973. For those people that really want to get into the weeds, and so that means that a lot of it just was a commonplace to be employed as a person with a disability. Still, going to college or university and getting a degree was still very difficult. And find a place to live, to fly, to drive, all of those were real challenges. You had to be 25 to rent a car. I was 21 when I finally got out of the hospital, and um, so it's good to have people that thought, well, you can do this, you can make something. Don't let these things stand in your way. I mean, my commander, Clarence McKnight or C.E. McKnight, when I was in the hospital, he came to me and he said, "Don't let this stop you. You can go on and get a degree. You can do great things." And
And you have.
and so that was, that all those things sort of influence you, and then try to do your best to do the same thing for others.
Can you
So
talk a little? I think voices like that when we're at our lowest, right? And that had to be devastating when you were injured. Um, when we're at our lowest, when we're questioning ourselves, voices that help lead us up through those lift us up through those challenges, are people that I think are so inspiring. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it's like to lead through adversity? What does it take? I mean, I think you could look at all you've achieved, Rory, and say, "Wow, he's just a supernatural human being to have accomplished all this." Um, or you could say he's someone who applies these principles, and I'm certain it's the latter. So, can you talk a little bit about the things that influence your ability to rise above the challenges, and not just the physical challenge? I'm talking just everyday life and in work, because I think you definitely have the secret sauce nailed. So tell us, what is it?
I think if I can quote City Slickers, it's everybody has to find that for themselves, right? And the I mean, I think for me, I have a pretty high capacity for work, and
Do you? I think you got enough degrees to count on both hands. So that's clearly the case. So okay, your work ethic is one thing. What else,
so I,
Rory?
so I think that's it. I was a runner. I still like to hand cycle, and wheelchair racing and still have, and those are so I'm okay. I don't I enjoy pushing myself and sort of pushing the limits, and I think having that so it develops both mental and physical stamina, right? That you can that I've actually ridden my hand cycle from Pittsburgh to Washington D.C. For those of you who don't know, that's about 340 miles by
How'd you even come up with the idea to do that? Was that simple?
um, so I came up. I didn't really come up with the idea to do that. Our local veterans leadership program uh, did it as wanted to do a fundraiser uh, for to help homeless veterans in the region and reemployment of veterans. And so I thought to myself, uh, I'd really like to be part of that. And so I trained up for it and did it. And the only downside was talking about, if you want about testing yourself. Yeah, the idea is, oh, let's have it end on 4th of July at the Pentagon. That seemed like a really good idea. Um, I don't think we thought through it at the time that the 4th of July in Washington, D.C. can be wicked hot
Yeah.
and humid. And
Yep. Always humid
so,
in the summer in DC.
so about 120 of us started in Pittsburgh and about 30 of us finished. Um, but it was good. It's sort of that same thing, teamwork and people helping each other, and it also showed preparation is important. Those of us prepared made it. Those that didn't prepare didn't make it. Um, and I think, but I also think that there's in the army and in a lot of the branches of service, sometimes you just have to learn to embrace the suck, right? And that's how you get through. Um, Also, um, it takes a lot of work to take on hard problems, and takes teamwork to take on hard problems, and you just have to be, um, you know, willing to prepare and willing to make the effort and put it through. And so, I think those, those things all help me over the years, and and then I think the other thing is not being afraid of failing. Um,
I
as
think
you,
that's huge because I think all of us are a little bit afraid of failure, and you've heard all the quotes. You gotta fail to win, and sometimes failure is a win. You just don't see it at the right time. But I think that's also, I think requires a comfortable, a level of comfort with vulnerability, right?
sure. Well, two things. One, in sports, you learn that you lose. You're not going to win every game, and you're going to lose sometimes. And even as a runner, you're not going to win every race, you have to learn to adapt to losing. But the other thing is if I've unfortunately come near death 3 times, and that gives you some perspective on life about when it comes um, to sort of to face difficult challenges and overcome them, right? And then also it gives you that perspective that you know if I don't get a grant, it's not the same thing as being in intensive care for a week.
Oh
It's
my gosh,
and
absolutely.
so
It's the truth.
you get that perspective that I um, in the movie As Good as It's Get, like Jack Nicholson said, it's not like our life is so bad. It's just that some people's lives is just picnics and noodle salad. So you just get used to it over. At some point, you just realize that this is not the worst thing that can happen to you,
That's true.
and
That's
and
true.
so you just the point is get back up and go,
Power through.
right? And that a lot of times what you learn too is if you do that, that's how you make a difference, because a lot of other people will quit along the way. And if you don't quit on yourself and you don't quit on others, and you can go a long ways.
Easterseals is very committed to supporting veterans, and we have been since World War II, the end of World War II. And um, I think, and I'm very open about my feelings regarding supporting veterans. I don't think we are doing enough as a nation for our veterans. I don't think we're doing enough to support our disabled veterans and people with disabilities writ large. And I think there's a long way to go. Can you talk a little bit about that and your feelings? Because one of the things we've talked about on many of these podcasts is our commitment to accessibility, Easterseals commitment, that is. And in the past year or so, we launched the accessible air travel campaign to make air travel more accessible to people with disabilities. And I know you and I had a conversation a few years ago, and you served on a panel at our forum and talked about how difficult it's been for you and to travel, to do as much as you've done. You're a speaker, you're a renowned speaker. You've traveled all over the world. Can you talk a little bit about how you tackled that? Because I don't want to give it away what you've done to be able to travel, but it is pretty impressive. And I think you serve as such a sterling example of what we talked about, overcoming adversity and adapting. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I think there's got a couple of questions nested in
Yeah,
there, but
yeah,
uh,
I gave you a lot to cover.
I cover all three of the groups: veteran, disabled veteran, and person with a disability. And I experienced life prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which really transformed life for people with disabilities, not in the United States but around the world. Um, People ask me what was the biggest change in my life after the Americans with Disabilities Act, and really, quite frankly, the biggest change was that at least the United States government recognized, and I think eventually the citizens started to recognize that people with disabilities are citizens and they have value in society. I think that I think the challenge that you're basically alluding to is that um, it's it's not so much that we need to do more for our veterans or our veterans with disabilities or people with disabilities. Is We need to work more to uh, integrate them into society and to uh, and to include them in opportunities, because it's really good for all of us. Um, there's tremendous talent in our veterans population, in our population of people with disabilities, that the U.S. and the world could benefit from, if only we uh, provide the opportunities and the resources for people to contribute, and also the recognition that they have value, they can add value to our communities, and they do add value to our communities, and they can add more value if given the opportunities. And I think that is, I think, often that where we fall short in all of those communities um, and it's I sort of view it from an engineer's view that we the way we solve problems is we can you can use calculus, you can use uh, transforms and use algebra. You can use, topology and mapping, and there's all kinds of different techniques that engineers and physicists and scientists have developed over the centuries. And it's the same thing if you include women and men and people with disabilities and people of color and different, ethnic and racial and origin countries and life experience and veteran status and whether they have a disability or not is um, how you can tackle grand challenges or big problems by working together. And um, I also believe that everybody has value, and everybody can add to both intellectual and social capacity. And and that's the problem if you start to exclude people or you don't include people. Sometimes it's done unconscious, unconscious bias, and so we need to make an effort really to reach out and provide opportunities. And I'm also biased because I am an engineer, and I think that there's a tremendous opportunity for more inclusion of veterans and people with disabilities, including our veterans with disabilities, if they for in STEM careers. I like to say science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. So two M's, medicine being the broader health scheme. Uh, and where people can also bring their lived experiences into it as well. I mean, a lot of people, the military is a very technical field now. People often don't realize that, and the skills that they learn. I tell leaders, a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to speak at the Surgeon General's conference and speak to all the general officers in medicine. And one of the things I told them, and and not trying to brag, but I said there are Rory Coopers in your formation right now, and there's some private out there that is 30, 40 years from now going to do some amazing things, and you need to realize that, right? It's just because they're early in their military career, early in their adult life, for that matter, um, doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of talent, they don't have a lot of drive, and it means there are some really great people out there, and you should be aware of that. I think it's the same thing as there are hopefully our school teachers and our college professors and trade schools and community colleges are also realizing that there are amazing veterans and people with disabilities that are already in their classrooms or in their workplaces that, if given greater opportunity, could shine even brighter and make even greater accomplishments. And I'm one of my favorite topics and concerns is that we often lose our kids with disabilities about middle school. Uh,
Why do you think that is, Rory?
well, I think it is because after middle school, curricula starts to be more individualized. So you can sort of take this track of you're going to go to college, or you're going to go to trade school, or you're just going to go straight into the workforce, and oftentimes we look at our kids with disabilities and say, well, including them in the science lab or in biology class is difficult. So we're just going to sort of push them over to this other direction. And that limits um, it actually says to them, we don't think you can do this, when they might want to do this and might have an interest in doing it. Maybe they were really good at at their childhood toys and middle school toys that where they could do programming and build robots and things like that. And then all of a sudden they've got people they respect and who have influence over their futures, um, sort of discouraging them, or at least not encouraging them. And and that I think um, and I've had the privilege of chairing some National Academy committees and serving on some where we, and it always comes down to, um, you know, if, at least in the STEM careers, peer mentors and role models, um, and accessibility of laboratories, accessibility of software, curriculum design, and field work. And we really need to work collectively to solve those problems. One, because we want all of our young people to have the opportunities to pursue whatever their talent, wherever their talents and interests lie, and having any kind of um, impairment, whether that's physical, sensory, intellectual, cognitive, or economic, shouldn't be a barrier, right? We should at least, and so that's one of the things that Easterseals provides. I mean, one of the programs I think is amazing is like make the first five count, right? So, and because it recognizes you can be disadvantaged pretty early on, and so Easterseals helping with kids that are you know cognitively different or for that matter have hearing impairments. And one of my colleagues here was diagnosed with hearing impairment by Easterseals, and when he was a kid, and now is going on to be very successful, and but you, as you know, Kendra, very well, if you don't get those if those children are neurodiverse or have a hearing impairment or a visual impairment or or maybe have a mobility impairment, they don't get recognized early and get assistance early. They can be pigeonholed as not being able or
That's
to
so
do something.
so true, Rory. The earlier that intervention takes place, the better those children do throughout their educational life. And studies correlate. The earlier the intervention is made, the better chances of keeping those kids in school. Post middle school, like you said. Two things. I want to go back to my 5 questions in one question that I gave you. You covered everything except the one I really wanted you to talk about, and it's because you're so humble. But you told me, and you told the people you talked to on that panel I referenced, what you did to be able to fly, what you do to be able to fly. And I think, if
Sure,
I have this correct, you re-engineered your wheelchair. Did you not?
I did. I re-engineered my wheelchair. I'm actually looking to maybe re-engineer it again because they keep changing the aircraft in the interiors. Um, but flying is actually we have some projects funded by the Agency on Community Living to look at flying. So a couple of things. What I've done, I've re-engineered my wheelchair so I can use it as an aisle chair. I can store it in the overhead compartment or in the wheelchair accessible closet. Although that's an education thing. Almost every time I fly, two things. I kid. A lot of times the pilot or the person will come out and say, "Oh, Mr. Cooper, you're gonna have to get the aisle chair. You'll never get down the chair aisle of the airplane in your chair." And I say, "I'll bet you the cost of this airplane if I get down in my seat in this chair." Most of them don't have the authority to do that, but and then they're very shocked. It's like, oh man, that's amazing. Everybody should have one like that. I probably should if you fly evenly, but that's something where that has to be made broadly commercially available, and that's also sort of a tricky thing about how we don't take the VA takes a very holistic view of assistive technology to provide community reintegration and allow veterans to fully contribute to society. Most people, though, live off of private insurance, which is very restrictive and doesn't necessarily take a very holistic view, but more takes a minimal health maintenance view. And then, in some cases, I could put it in the closet. We have to do a little education once in a while. I have to fly on the longer flights with my wife, and they're usually crews put their luggage in there because it's empty a lot of the times, and it's a kind of a natural human thing to do. But you have to really say, well, really, you see, there's kind of a wheelchair symbol on there, and the air carrier access it. That's kind of where the wheelchairs are supposed to be stored, and um, I know it's an inconvenience, but you really do need to move your luggage somewhere else. Most of them do when they get educated. Most of them don't realize that that's actually what that symbol and that fine text
It's
that's
for,
written
right?
on the
Right.
closet says. Um, and um, it's kind of interesting. Um, the now what we're actually looking at is not only making that, my lab's actually working on a new wheelchair that you can use in the airport and converts to an aisle chair. And so the airports, when people that don't use a wheelchair, they only use it at the airport, can actually get around and then not have to transfer twice to get to the seat. But
It's
we're
exciting.
also
That's
working
really
to
exciting.
allow people who use power wheelchairs to stay seated in their power chair when they fly. I know, Kendra, you're aware, and those that are actively involved in the area realize that a lot of people don't fly or have stopped flying because they need their um, oxygen source or their ventilator, respirator. They need their power seat functions um, to sustain their health, even sustain their life, and they can't really sit in an airplane seat.
Hmm. Are you encouraged by the strides that have been made, Rory, or do you think it's moving too slowly?
Uh,
Both.
my perspective is over 45 years, so um, it is. I'm encouraged that at least we are not only in the discussion, we're actually doing designs. And the aircraft manufacturers, the airline industry, and the advocacy and the ally organizations of people with disabilities are we're all talking at least, and all of us agree that something needs to be done. We haven't agreed necessarily on what needs to be done, but we have agreed that something needs to be done and it needs to be inclusive. I'm optimistic with the changes that have occurred in the Air Carrier Access Act recently, are taking a positive step in the right direction. Um, I also think there's an economic argument for it. Even if you just look at, can the family travel with grandma and grandpa who need to stay in the wheelchair when they travel, or even if they transfer, that they could do it more easily, and or if they've got a themselves with a disability that stop traveling and the family no longer can travel either, or kids, and it's not just it's not just leisure travel, right? It's access to specialty health care. It's employment related travel. Um, it could be our if you think about participation in our own government and its leadership is limited by some extent if you can't get to the state capitol or you can't get to Washington D.C. So there are leaders can hear what constituent needs are. So they only hear from a limited set of constituents.
That's so true, Rory. And I think you are aware. We have a gentleman on our team. He's a consultant. He's a full-time consultant. His name is Rob Engel. He's a disabled man, and he works on government relations. And he's told me repeatedly, it's I'd love to come to the Hill with you. It's not as easy for me. I use forearm crutches, and he said I know where every dip, every break in the sidewalk is, every uneven surface, and we don't think about that. Can you, if you think about, and you've referenced it a few times, the importance and the watershed event that the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act was 33, 34 years ago. But when you think about that today, Rory, what needs to be modified? What in your mind is the primary adjunct or modification that needs to be made to take people with disabilities even farther, to make our society more inclusive? Is there one thing, or are there multiple things that you think are imperative at this point?
Well, there's multiple things. Although I think the most important thing, in my view, is gainful employment. Um, I think it changes. It will change culture and change access. And if we see more people with disabilities in the workplace, if they're colleagues and supervisors and leaders, I mean, well, just to give you look what Tammy Duckworth has been able to do for the Senate. Um, and, she's not the first. Jim Langevin in the House, and there's been a few here and there, but every time they come in, they transform that organization, and that's sort of a unique example to some extent. Although it's been great that we've had Bob Dole and ever since World War II. Fortunately, there's been some, well, for that matter, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So we have a long history of getting change agents at national leadership, but really you know the um, the other you want to see changes. You know, Vince Cerf is the inventor of the internet. He's one of the vice presidents of Alphabet. That's the parent company for Google, who is hearing impaired. And and when you've got somebody at that level, and they talk about we need to make accommodations for people with disabilities so they can be productive members of our of our teams, and that's important, and that if you need we need more of that, right? So there, uh, it that way you can see you don't always see people with disabilities like, well, we need to make an accommodation for them
Hmm.
so they can get to the
It's
grocery.
integrated. It's just
Right, it's
integrated,
all
right?
integrated, right, and at all levels. So we need to be all sectors of employment, all levels of employment, um, and it's I think would help the U.S. help global economy, global integration. But that's how we're going to make the next step in progress, and that will lead to what other physical accommodations we need, right? So um, that could be, obviously, if one of us becomes the CEO of one of the major airlines, you could basically just say, look,
Would be a game changer, wouldn't it?
we're gonna make this happen, right? And of course, if they do, and it finds out that they gain market share, you're going to see everybody else
Well,
follow suit.
you touched on it. Americans with disabilities account for a quarter of a population. You know, a quarter of all Americans identify as being disabled, and I think that that fact gets lost in the mix. We talk a lot about the cost of adapting things to make them more accessible. What we don't talk about is what you touched on, the economic impact of engaging and integrating more people with disabilities in the workforce, in tourism, in travel, in healthcare, in education. I think we just need to flip the switch on that.
I
Um,
do, and then not only that, there we all have hopefully we all have friends and family, right? So they're so it really touches all of us, and yet some of it's pretty common sense stuff, and some of the people use every day. You know, uh, AI, which everybody's talking about now, the first practical applications of AI were for people with disabilities. Spell check, word prediction, then literal phrase prediction, sentence prediction, and now it's generative AI. Um, Smartphones came about, and texting was made as an accommodation for individuals who are hearing impaired, right? It really came out of the TTY system and even before that. And I'd be willing to bet that there are more uh, tweens and teens that text than there are hearing impaired individuals.
I think you definitely got that right. Thank you.
And
So I so appreciate you giving your unvarnished, your candid thoughts on everything from disability to education to mentorship and leadership. But can you tell us one thing people can't Google about you? There's something about you that people just can't find out if they were to Google you and look for more information on Rory Cooper on the internet? What would that be?
Uh, yeah, there's probably there's a couple of things. So I'm a childless cat lover.
Not a lady, but a childless cat lover. Love that. Good answer, Roar. That's terrific. Thank you. Thank you. I have one more question before I let you go. We like to end all of our episodes with an Ask Me Anything segment, so stick around for that. But before I do, one last question for you, Rory, and that is, I often say on these things, I love to read. I think I probably don't read a fraction of what you read, and I consider myself an avid reader. So this is a loaded question. Is there anything you're reading right now, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend to our listeners? Doesn't have to be about disability. Doesn't have to be about leadership. Can be just something you're enjoying or that has been impactful, something you've read or are reading recently.
Well, right now I'm reading two books, The Boys in the Boat, which
Saw that on the New York Times bestseller list.
yes, and that was funny because I spoke at the National Academies and gave their lecture on science and society, and I mentioned that when I was a student, I kind of asked the ROTC to help me carry me up the stairs and stuff because engineers are not necessarily your your most athletic of the members of the student community. But they pointed out to me that the boys in the boat, both of those were engineers and Olympians. I'm proud to be an engineer and a Paralympian. So there are exceptions to the rule. The other book I'm reading, my wife recommended. It's actually it was published in the early 1960s. It's called The King's Orchard. It probably wouldn't interest most people, but it's about the origins of Pittsburgh.
Oh, neat. Well, as somebody who's residing in Pittsburgh, I'm sure you like it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. That it's sort of a fictional book, but with true characters intertwined into it. Real life characters, um, and it's fun because if you live here, the names of these people that helped found the city are the names of the streets and some of the neighborhoods and districts here. So that's that's a book I'm reading too. It's a little lighter, but it's kind of also interesting to see the origins of our city. And even the University of Pittsburgh founding is in the book as well. And it's also kind of funny because if you go on the campus of the University of Pittsburgh, there's a replica of the original University of Pittsburgh, which is basically a one room log schoolhouse. So
Come a
those are,
long way since then.
yeah, and then I'm a big fan of Richard Feynman's books. For those people that know, Richard Feynman was a Nobel laureate physicist. Um, I've read all of his books, um, his textbooks on physics, as well as his books on life, um, and it was obviously brilliant. It's most people, if you're going to win a Nobel Prize in physics, you have to usually be a fairly smart person. Um, and I had the privilege of actually getting to see him give a lecture when he was still alive back in the early 1980s, and also quite an amazing speaker as well. And so his books are really great, and they have some really wonderful lessons in life about not taking yourself too seriously, and also sort of exploring, never losing, some of the childhood aspects of childhood wonder throughout your life, because that allows you to explore, be open to new things and explore new things, and then those books I any one of the Feynman books.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on because I think definitely open to exploring new things. Your whole life is epitomizes that thought process. Thank you so much, Rory. I have so enjoyed this, and I could ask you 20 more questions. We might have to do a part two. Trying to get on your calendar will take us a year, so maybe we meet again at this time next year and continue this conversation. Between now and then, I hope to see a lot more of you, and just really want to extend my heartfelt thanks. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kendra. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to Easter Seals. The one things that I don't, I guess the other thing that what people won't necessarily know about me, but um, when I was first injured the first time, Easter Seals was sort of instrumental in helping me access the VA and actually introducing me to wheelchair sports and things like that. So um, the it used to be Easter Seals of Central California. Now I think several Easter Seals out there have merged, but um, that it's um, that gave me an early appreciation for the work that Easter Seals does across the continuum of people with disabilities.
I actually think that's one of the best things we do to support veterans is help them identify what services are really available, help them navigate the morass of healthcare resources that are available to them, and the morass of paperwork and just logistics it requires to avail themselves to, yes, what they get through the VA, but also through private medicine, through the state, through their local NGO providers like Easterseals. So love that we close on that. Again, thank you so much, Rory. Really appreciate this. Now on to Ask Me Anything. So here is our question. In your experience, how does fostering a transparent culture impact employee innovation and creativity? Are there specific practices you've seen that can enhance this aspect, even beyond regular feedback? Well, I think beyond regular feedback, feedback is important. Unvarnished feedback, I think, to employees that goes both ways, right? That goes from manager to direct report and direct report to manager. And I think it's important to ensure that employees feel that they're safe in saying, this isn't working, or I didn't understand when you gave me this directive, or I think we could do this more efficiently, or I have a new idea I'd like to run by you. I don't think employees feel comfortable sharing those kind of things with leaders, with managers, unless they're operating in a culture, in a work culture where transparency is valued. Transparency creates opportunity for vulnerability, and developing a level of comfort around vulnerability is, I think, one of the most critical things any organization needs if they really espouse a commitment to transparency, because transparency means the good, the bad, the ugly, the different, the unspoken is okay to voice. And if it's not, then that transparency is going to be extinguished before the light even takes hold. So I think you need to work at creating a culture where people can safely share differing opinions, and that's been a struggle for me because I'm someone who always has a very strong opinion. So as a manager, I sometimes have to bite my tongue or tell people, I feel this way, but don't be shy about telling me you feel differently. And saying and doing are two different things, right? You have to inculcate or imbue that in your direct reports, in your colleagues, that they're safe differing, voicing a different opinion, that you're not going to hold it against them. Or if your opinions, like mine, my family often tells me, Mom, you feel strongly about everything from, the color of your shirt in the morning to how you feel about societal issues. And that's not untrue. I am pretty passionate. And I recognize now, 35, 36 years into my career, that can be intimidating as a leader and someone in a position of leadership to people who aren't, So that's something I'm working on. I'm a work in progress, like we all are. And I think listening more, talking less also helps people to feel comfortable sharing and to creating that culture of transparency. You can create it. Preserving it is another thing. It takes an awful lot to sustain a culture of transparency because let's face it, there are often shocks. There are things that happen that cause us to second guess ourselves. We're human. We make mistakes. We get angry, we get frustrated, we express those frustrations, people take it personally. There's all kinds of things that can derail a culture of transparency. And again, it goes back to a level of comfort with vulnerability, but also humility. I think leaders, managers need to be comfortable, need to get comfortable saying, okay, I was wrong. Or even more so, I was wrong and I'm sorry. That is not easy to do for anyone, but for a leader when you're going down a path and you're bringing everyone along with you, and sometimes kicking and screaming. Sometimes people don't see things your way, and you're trying to get them to do what you want them to do, what you think is the best thing, and then it turns out that isn't the best thing. It didn't work. I think resisting the very natural urge to contract information and keep it close when things aren't going right, and instead open kimono. Look, this didn't go the way we wanted it to. We need to do better. We'll do better in the future, I think is where good leadership really begins and poor leadership ends. Easterseals empowers people with disabilities and their families to be full and equal participants in their communities and within society. Easterseals is where everyone can feel welcomed and people know that they aren't judged, but treated with the dignity that they deserve. Each day, we provide life-changing services nationwide and advocate for policies that improve quality of life. From employment to housing services to job training, childcare and respite care, adult day programs, and so much more, Easterseals is making a profound impact in thousands of communities every day. You can learn more by visiting Easterseals.com. That concludes our episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard, be sure to write a review, like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to join us in the next episode as we discuss how we can all get on board with transparent leadership.